Preseason planning in soccer, why heart rate still matters. Welcome everybody, greetings from Finland. And our guest speaker, sports scientist Dr. James Malone, is going to be joining me on stage in just a couple of minutes. It is a key time for preseason training in all sports. In the picture here, you can see Finnish ice hockey team Tappara doing some stair training. And interestingly, just a few days ago, there was an article in our local paper about NBA star Lauri Markkanen, who told that he's doing his most intensive preseason training right now here in Jyväskylä, which is his hometown. So definitely good time to get some information about that. I'm Tiina Hoffman, exercise physiologist and master trainer at Firstbeat, and I'll be hosting today's session. I work for our wellness business, providing training and webinars for health and wellness professionals who use the Firstbeat Live solution with their clients. Today's webinar is going to last 1 hour, and the Q&A box will be open the whole time, so you can write questions there, and then we'll answer them after James's keynote in the end. The webinar is recorded as usual, and you'll get a link to the recording afterwards in case you have to leave early or something like that. If you are new to us, as some might be, just a couple of words about Firstbeat. There is lots of information on our website, so please visit that too to read more about our background and some of our solutions. But we specialize in providing physiological solutions for wellness and for team sports. Today, over 1,000 professional sports teams across all the different major leagues use the Firstbeat Sport Physiology platform with their athletes. Over 300 scientific publications have been made that have utilized some of the Firstbeat methods in their studies, and over 1,000 wellness professionals around the world use the Firstbeat Live solution with their clients. And Firstbeat Sport, the solution in a nutshell here. It's a physiology platform for team coaching, and it starts with gathering accurate data. So we use a sensor, a high-quality sensor that measures the athlete's heartbeat, heart rate belt during the training session. And then the coach or the trainer or the person running the session can see the real-time data on their screen of each of the players, allowing them to individualize the training session and turn up or turn down the intensity as needed. And then afterwards, there is a full reporting and analytics of the whole session at individual level and at team level afterwards, so that you can plan next steps for your training. And more information about this solution and also in the email that we will send afterwards. But at this point, welcome back to our webinar series. James Malone, we are looking forward to today's interesting topic. My own background is in endurance sports, where heart rate monitoring is one of the key metrics. So I'm really interested to hear about how this is used in team sports. So welcome, James.
Right. Well, yeah, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I know it's obviously a super busy time for a lot of European-based practitioners in football. Well, pretty much any in the world, it's always busy. But I think today's topic is obviously something I think people are really interested in right now. So hopefully we can provide some information, some concepts to take away, and hopefully I can answer some of your questions at the end as well. But essentially, the talk is all about why heart rate still matters, and I'll come on to why I've chosen that title in a short while. But just very briefly, for those who don't know me, so my name is James. I've been a sports scientist now for, I guess, over 15 years in my career, starting back in 2009 in football. So that was during my internship at Everton Football Club. So I spent a year as a first team intern sports scientist. And then following that period, I worked 3 years with the first team at Liverpool Football Club. During that time, I also did my PhD full-time as well in collaboration with the club. Following that period, I spent 3 years working for Catapult Sports. So I travelled around Europe quite a lot and visited a lot of teams, which was great. And then following that period, decided to settle down somewhat. I spent the last 8 to 9 years working as a senior lecturer at a university in Liverpool. And at the start of this year, I decided to try something a bit different. So I went self-employed, and I've now founded my company, Malone Performance, where I most of the time mentor and guide practitioners in football around their careers and skills, amongst other things such as doing talks and webinars and things like that. But anyway, that's enough about me. In terms of the objectives for today, I think the key thing for me is to try and introduce some of the concepts around pre-season, first of all. I'm pretty sure most of you will be familiar with a general rule of how we plan a pre-season and how we hopefully get players through the process and out the other side fit and healthy and ready for the season. But I just wanted to focus today more on the use of heart rate because it's something that I feel is slowly dying, unfortunately, in football. I think with the boom of GPS and the use of external load, as I'll come on to, we've now seen this drop off in people using heart rate, even though it was often the foundation in the sort of 90s and 2000s of a lot of training programs that we do. So we'll try and hit on these three learning objectives as we go through. But I think the first thing is just to talk about pre-season itself, because it is really difficult these days to plan a good pre-season. If you think about, at the moment we've got Chelsea who and PSG who've just literally finished the FIFA World Club Championship, whatever you want to call it, only last week. So for them, the season has only just finished, and as we know, the start of the domestic season is only about 4 or 5 weeks away. So for teams like this who are now facing this crazy all year round schedule, pre-season is almost becoming a second thought. That being said, there are those opportunities if we can to structure training over maybe a 5 to probably at most 8 week period for most teams. But I think this study here by Jan Ekstrand as part of the UEFA study group, I think really does hit the nail on the head when they looked at some of the retrospective data across the injury study group, and he said that for every 10 additional completed sessions that players will do, it then resulted in 22-day layoff reduction per 1,000 hours of practice. So in simple terms, what that means is if you're able to train and complete most of the pre-season in a structured way without doing crazy things, you're able to tolerate load better in season, you have a reduction in injury, and obviously then on the football pitch, hopefully performance is also great as well. So this is why pre-season is so important, because even though it's short, it really does lay the foundations for everything else that follows in the year. And I think in terms of my experience as a practitioner, as an academic as well, these are probably the four big practical common challenges that we face. So I've already mentioned one of them being time constraints with, this, like I say, this almost year-round calendar schedule that we've got. We've got the World Cup coming up soon next year. We've got African nations tournaments, we've got, Nations League, all of these extra things now which we have to contemplate and often plan around as practitioners. The second point, obviously, is the variation in fitness. I mean, these days it's not as bad as it used to be. When players go away for the off season now, they've got given structured training, they've got technology to track things. So when they return for that first day in pre-season, typically they're of a better level than maybe 10, 20 years ago. That being said, you do have some players who still don't put the work in off season or don't quite hit as much as they should have done. Maybe they've eaten few too many ice creams in that off season. So there is that variance we see with the fitness levels of our squad. You also might have some players returning from injury. So maybe they've had a return to play towards the back end of the previous season, but it's just maybe a bit too late for them to integrate back into the team. So they've kind of ticked over during the off season, and now they're having to reintegrate in the preseason, which is really tough actually. So again, you have to try and individualize load and manage those types of players. And the last one is commercial commitment. So something I experienced firsthand at Liverpool myself is, you're often taking on these amazing tours to Asia and America, which is fantastic, but from a planning perspective, can be a bit of a nightmare with sudden time zone difference changes and jet lag, fatigue from travel, crazy schedules, having to do media appearances for players as well. So all of these things, especially at the top end, can really challenge and refocus what we have to do. So with training load itself, obviously, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the concept, but just to highlight really the classical Impellizzeri model, as it's known, looking at external, internal load. I think for me, why tracking load is so important in pre-season is that it often helps to make better decisions. I wrote in my newsletter last week about what would happen if we completely remove sports science from football, because I do get coaches still say to me, James, why do we need all this? What's the point in all this data? But straight away, I think you lose that sort of evidence base. You lose the objectiveness of what we're trying to do. So, heart rate, GPS, all of these tools that we've got, access to these days, it really does help to try and balance that stimulus between adaptation and injury risk. So, as with any type of training, whether it's football, endurance sports, whatever, if we do too much too soon, it's not a good thing. And if we don't do enough, we become undertrained and then we're not prepared for the demands of that sport. So, it's all about that Goldilocks principle of trying to balance the stimulus at the right times. And I'll go through some examples of that in terms of the weeks and how we periodize it. And essentially trying to create this readiness model for, when it comes to that first game of in season, are they ready to go? Are they ready to perform? But then are they still ready to go in game 50 or 60 of that domestic season? And yet, very common, as I'm sure you know, but we obviously have this split based on the model. So we've got our external load, which is our physical work, which is then prescribed. So often, a coach will have a plan for the day, for the week. Sometimes that plan doesn't quite get adhered to. So you might have a situation where, you've planned for certain drills or certain sets and reps, and for whatever reason, it doesn't quite happen. So we prescribe our external load, but then it's obviously then what's also observed and what's actually completed by that player. But then the other side of that coin is the internal response. So heart rate being one of the key measures that we can look at for internal load. And everybody's different, everyone's individual. And this is why for me it's super important that we look at both of these concepts together, because if we only just look at external load, it tells me what I've done, but it's not telling me how I've responded and adapted ultimately. So really crucial we get a balance of these two parts of the equation. And I just thought I'd share this actually because, again, like I say, I'm a big proponent of internal load. I think it's something that we're starting to lose a lot in football. On Monday, I sent this out on LinkedIn to my followers and just to see, what people are currently focusing on or using in pre-season. And as you can see here, by far the winner of this vote is GPS. Nearly 75% of just over 200 people who voted said they use GPS mostly for tracking preseason training. So heart rate was actually the third option of the three main ones. So RP was number two, and then heart rate was actually only just below 10%, which in a way surprises, but also for me doesn't surprise me because I think GPS is so accessible. It's so easy to just flick a device on and off you go. Whereas heart rate takes a bit of, calibration in terms of getting sure the belt is okay, make sure you've got the right max heart rate to base things on. So it's a little bit more work to set up, but once you do have it set up with a company like Firstbeat, it really does help to understand how that load response is going. And as I say, I think for me, even though it is apparently not as common or not as used, it does really tell you something, especially in pre-season, about how an individual is responding to that load. So there's, several papers or key papers out there that shows the links between what we do from a heart rate standpoint and then developing things such as aerobic fitness. As we know, aerobic fitness is so crucial for anything we do in football. Okay, maybe not so much the high intensity actions, your sprints, your accels, decels, but if you think 60, 70% of the game is lower intensity, and if you've got a higher aerobic base, then you're able to recover between high intensity efforts a lot better. Then having a solid cardiovascular system makes sense in a lot of things in football. But like I say, that being said, people, for whatever reason, decide to not focus on it. Maybe some of the technical elements, which I've covered in a previous webinar for Firstbeat. But for me, it's still such a key component of the monitoring toolbox. And probably there's different things, and I'll come on to different measures that you can use with Firstbeat, but probably the three most common areas that football practitioners will focus on. Number one being your time in the sort of the red zone, as we call it. So some people will, describe that as 85% and above. For me, I think 90% based on the literature has got a much stronger link between adaptation. So if you're able to get a good solid max heart rate, you're able to firstly see that time in the top zone, but then also your your below zones as well. So it might be a 5-zone system or 3-zone, whatever you choose to be. Trimp as well, which is obviously something that's been around for decades, but specifically with Firstbeat, they offer a Trimp model, which I'll come on to, which is really sensitive to change in load as well, which can be really useful just to track overall internal load each day and then across the weeks. And then from more of a recovery standpoint, obviously we've got heart rate variability. We can also use heart rate recovery from a sub-maximal test, for example. So these sorts of things also measure that response in our changes in fitness and readiness over time. So Firstbeat themselves, I've been using them for a number of years now, and used them all the way back when I was at Liverpool over 10 years ago now. And I think for me, it's just a really solid system in terms of the quality of data, the live information that you get as well. But as you can see from the list here, we've got a number of key features that we can hopefully use to better plan and intervene as well on the spot when it comes to pre-season training. One of the new features, which I'm sure the guys at Firstbeat can tell you more about, is the physiological testing component in the software now. So it's very easy to essentially set up sub-maximal heart rate testing. So if you do, for example, a part of a yo-yo test or any sort of standardized protocol that you might run, such as a warm-up, you can then use that information to derive the sub-maximal heart rate data as well. So the software really does make it easy to look at things like this, and also, as you can see from the image, to track your load longitudinally and to see where each individual player is at any given time. But ultimately, the goal of pre-season is 3 things, really. So a lot of people obviously think of it as building physical capacity, which it is. It's trying to build our aerobic base. It's trying to increase our tolerance to high intensity load as well, from accels, decels, sprints, and things like this. We also need to be thinking of the tactical component. So, I think I've had some interesting conversations lately with different football coaches saying, you see sports scientists and fitness coaches just doing aimless runs and crazy runs in the forest in pre-season and things like this. And I'm pretty sure now that sort of approach is pretty much gone. There might still be some people doing it, but I think for the guys I work with anyway, a lot of the running based work typically has a physiological reason, such as mass testing and running and things like this. But a lot of the time we try and use the ball. Sometimes we do need to do some pure running to get the right adaptation. But I'd say, most practitioners, probably 80-90% of the time, will try and choose conditioning drills that, also have a technical or tactical component as well. So it isn't just about isolating training separately. And I think the third thing as well is just building psychological readiness, which is maybe where the forest type runs and the hill runs came from back in the day. But there's other ways to do that, game-based conditioning and things like this, trying to perform under fatigue. We can certainly periodize that and build that across the preseason too. And I shared this slide recently on social media. It seemed to get quite a lot of traction, but I guess just to highlight where preseason fits in the overall picture of periodization. And this is, by the way, a very oversimplified view. It's certainly, football isn't this simple, unfortunately, but I do think, roughly speaking, this is the pattern we tend to follow. So from a purely physical standpoint, we obviously, our highest load is in pre-season, typically in terms of training. As soon as we get in season for that sort of 3 different stages of early, mid, and peak season, is pretty much a balanced load, where we pretty much play games, we recover, we try and keep non-starters as fit as we can. And then towards the back end and the business end of the season, we maybe reduce the load just to keep that freshness up and try and peak for our, hopefully, finals or relegation battles or whatever it is that's relative to you. And then obviously we have the off season where that load is reduced as well. So broadly speaking, that's the general pattern we'd look to follow, with pre-season very much the highest of the physical load. And in terms of how we can break pre-season down, so as I said at the start, it depends really on how long you've got. So if you're a Chelsea player right now, you've not got a lot of time. You've got straight into off season now. You've probably got a week or 2 preparation before the start of the Premier League season. If you may be a different team who's got 6 or 7 weeks, then you've got a little bit more time to progressively increase the load and build up our fitness and get things ready. So broadly speaking, for most teams, you'll probably have 3 different phases. You'll have this first, almost like an accumulation phase where you're trying to re-establish your foundation that was maybe lost somewhat in the off season. You then have this middle phase, which is more of an intensification of the load, where you'll typically peak in terms of your loading. And then the final phase where we try and reduce the load and we try and taper to dissipate that fatigue, maximize adaptation, and keep the freshness ready for the in-season period. So this is an example schedule with what we had with Liverpool. So often the first couple of weeks, like I say, were mostly geared around laying the foundations for the subsequent weeks. That intensification period in weeks 3 and 4 often coincided with a preseason tour away. So, like I say, we'd go to maybe Asia, Australia, America, something like this. That could obviously be tricky because, in an ideal world, those weeks are where you want to get your biggest load through the body. But if you've got the travel things going on, you've got the jet lag, you've got time zone changes, that becomes even harder in a way to plan and to manage. So I think in an ideal world, you'd probably go away to, I don't know, Austria or Finland in the hills and get some nice weather and some nice training done. But often that's not, that's taken out of your hands by the commercial team and depends on the size of the club. But then following that period, we've then got that 2 weeks where we can start to taper. So week 5 will still be fairly decent, but certainly by week 6, that pretty much transitions into a normal in-season microcycle as we go into the first game. So in terms of I'll just go through each phase in a bit more detail. So as I say, that early phase is about developing mostly aerobic capacity. So a lot of the intensity, as I've highlighted here, will be in the sort of zone 2, zone 3, which is typically below 80% of maximal heart rate. In terms of content, it'll be, some extensive type interval running, tempo running, which we can do, on an individual basis, depending on what type of fitness test you do. You can individualize those types of runs. On top of that, the football work, obviously, we can do, small-sided and medium-sided games. I wouldn't probably push too much for large-sided just yet in this early phase, just because we want to restrict the space that the players work in for restricting sprint and high-speed distance. But if we can control, the work to rest ratios and the intensity of the drills, we can certainly drop in some of the more football-based conditioning type work that obviously the coach would prefer. But then obviously, as you can see, we're trying to try and limit that time in the red zone in particular during these initial weeks. As we then transition into our hardest phase of preseason, this is where we're trying to replicate the match demand. So we certainly now flip up towards the zone 4 or 5 work, trying to get into that higher zone. A lot of this will be more hit-based conditioning. So whether you do that without the ball, we can obviously prescribe that as well individually. Or if you're going to do it with the ball, a lot of large-sided games, medium-sized, and even small-sided games will do the trick. Team-based drills as well, a lot of possession-based drills, transitional type work as well. All of these things will hopefully get you in those higher zones to get that adaptation as well. And then as we start to taper, I think one of the mistakes sometimes we can make is maybe dropping off a bit too much, because I think the taper in literature and football is actually quite weak. There's a lot in endurance sports, and as we know from the traditional research, a taper really, in some sports, it only adds a couple of percent. So in swimming and in some other endurance sports, it probably only adds 2, 3, 4% improvement in adaptation and performance in some cases. So in football, if we follow a similar approach where we keep intensity relatively high, probably around about 90% of what it normally is, but then we're really reducing that volume element of the training equation. So we're trying to get some brief exposures. So that's why we're still hitting zones 4 and 5. But again, we're just reducing that volume so that we can start to see the freshness come through and just keeping things topped up, such as, low volume positional games, or maybe some running type work, sprint maintenance work as well. And I think this is where first beat comes in really well. So as I mentioned, through those three different phases, we've got roughly different targets of heart rates, different zones that we can individualize for each player as well. So what you can do as a practitioner is on the sideline, you can use a tablet, as you can see here, to easily see a dashboard with all of the current heart rate responses from the players. So for example, if you're doing a small-sided game and you want to make sure that they're hitting in the sort of top zone 5, zone 4, above 80, 90%, you can track that real time to ensure that the players are actually, working hard enough essentially to hit those zones. Conversely, if there may be a drill where you don't want them going too hard, you can then look at that data and say, well, actually, the players are going a bit too hard, the coach is getting a bit carried away here. So that's where you can maybe have a word and intervene to do things like increase the rest intervals between bouts of small-sided games, change the pitch size, which is not great practically, but that's something you could maybe manipulate as well if they're getting a bit too much load there. Or you can shorten the work period or the sets of each of the games that they're currently doing as well. So specifically with first beat, there's a number of different metrics you could use. These are the four I would probably recommend personally, and ones I've used myself in the past. Trimp I mentioned before, which is first beat has its own calculation for this. There's also a training effect metric, which I'll come on to, which can be handy. The recovery status, which is a simple test you can do with the heart rate belt to basically guide your player's readiness status. And obviously then with the heart rate zones, as I mentioned on the last slide, trying to manipulate and manage the intensity of training. So with TRIMP, roughly speaking, it can be used as an accumulative score. So as you can see on the right-hand side, we've got very broad, kind of easy, moderate, and hard training zones that you could look at. So anything above 140 would be considered maybe a hard session in terms of accumulated heart rate. I remember with Trimp, we're obviously adding a weighting based on all of the different intensity zones. So, obviously, if you're at a lower heart rate, you get less weighting, and vice versa for the higher zones. You can also look at it individually. So you could look at it in terms of session or drill Trimp as well. As you can see from the figure, you can see anything above 2.2 Trimp per minute would be considered as hard. Anything below 1 would be easy. So again, if you're doing a bit of a drill analysis for the coach after the session, you can then see, how did the session flow? Did it go to plan? Was that drill too hard? Maybe next time around we need to manipulate it. So these different things we can use to generate some useful feedback. The training effect, which is probably less common amongst most practitioners, it's something that's specific to first beat, but essentially what you can have is a maximal score of 5, as you can see here. You've then got this breakdown, to different sort of effects. So whether you're a maintaining effect, you're trying to balance your load, whether you're improving, which is where you're trying to push fitness somewhat, so you're overreaching, or if you go too far and then you're non-functionally overreaching, where you get to a 5, and if you keep on doing that, that's where we get that non-functional effect. So I think to give the example with pre-season, we can see, the accumulation phase, the first couple of weeks would be to keep that fairly moderate, about 2 to a 3. The intensification phase, we would then push that higher to try and provide that overreaching stimulus. And then obviously with the taper phase, we're going to try and even though we're keeping intensity high, reduce the overall training effect to ensure that we're not carrying fatigue into the season. And then we can use the recovery insights to then hopefully see how the players individually are responding. So with first beat, you can see we've got a color-coded system. We've got the green, which is good to go, all good in terms of what today's score is, the recovery score out of 100 versus the 7-day average. You've then got maybe the caution, the sort of amber color there, which is where things are getting a little bit close to being overly fatigued. And then we've got the red flags, where we potentially need to modify or reduce the training for that given day, or maybe for the rest of that week within the plan. So I just want to highlight a couple of little case studies, I guess, mini case studies here, just to highlight some of the ways in which practically it could be used, and I'll share some example data from First Beat as well. So the first one is just a very simple case study. So I mentioned before how we can use the TRIMP or accumulated TRIMP score to plan our sessions. So based on those zones, those sort of easy, moderate, and hard, we can estimate, what should our weekly load be for the team or even for each individual player. So we can set in the software, we can set some targets for the team or individual, and then obviously we can track that based on our plan for that sort of 6 or 7 week period. So you can see using that example I've said before, where we've got 2 weeks accumulation, 2 weeks of intensified training, and then a 2-week taper. We can see, roughly the weekly targets with the black lines there. And then we've hopefully in this example, as you can see, we progressively increase the TRIMP or the demand placed on the internal load. And then by weeks 5 and 6, we see that, really big drop off in terms of load to get the taper. But obviously, we're still, as I said before, keeping that intensity, particularly in week 5. But by doing it in this way, we hopefully, can progressively increase so we avoid the spikes. Spikes is quite I guess, common term now we often hear off the back of Tim Gablett's work, but it's been around for many years. Endurance sports, we talk about the 10% rule, which, there's a really big study released last week actually on runners, where that sort of 10% rule was actually found to be far superior than things like the acute chronic ratio, for example. So I think as a rule of thumb, that's a really good one actually, is that 10% rule of trying not to increase, too much week on week if we can. That being said, obviously in weeks 3 and 4, that's where we do want to see that, that overreaching effect. So there may be a case where you go maybe a little bit above 10%, but not too much. But then if you reduce the load in weeks 5 and 6, where you get the super compensatory effect, I think, based on my experience, then, it'll be fine because you can overload. You've already built foundation in weeks 1 and 2, and then you've got the taper to hopefully get everything sorted out before the start of the season. And the second little mini case study, I guess, is in a similar way to what I mentioned at the start, where because we've got this obsession now with GPS, and I've used GPS for a long time, and it's certainly a really useful tool. But if that's all we focus on in terms of setting distance targets, or if you use whatever metabolic power or whatever metric you use, it doesn't tell you about the individual. So okay, we can individualize GPS thresholds for different physiological anchors, but it's still only telling us what they have done. It's not telling us the response. So you can see an example here, which I think highlights it perfectly. So you've got 2 players who, let's say in the training session, they both hit the around about 750 meters of high speed distance for the session. You then, if you just looked at that on the face value, you would say, okay, yeah, similar-ish, both player A and B will plan the same recovery program, the same training program for the rest of the week for them, all good to go. But if you actually collected heart rate data, you looked at the TRIMP values in this example here, you can see clearly that player B for the same external load and stimulus is actually struggling in a way, because they've got a much higher internal response than player A. So what that tells you straight away is the player B is potentially not as well conditioned, particularly aerobically, as player A. It might tell you that they're also just fatigued as well. So if you did maybe some of the recovery testing with First Beat as well, you'd get much greater picture in terms of the adaptation and the response to the external stimulus. So this is why for me, throughout my career, I've always measured both, and in addition RP as well, because it'll give you that full picture of what's going on in any given session. Whereas if you do just purely follow GPS and you just look at external load, it's actually not telling you the picture. Arguably heart rate or internal load is more important than external load, but that's something I'm open to debate about. And then I just wanted to share finally some real world data as well. So this is actually a snapshot provided by Firstbeat, where they've collated just over 6 million measurements, individual measurements from some of the top users around the world, some of the top clients. And I thought it was quite interesting, actually. This is although it's a little bit muddled up in terms of order, but you can see here. So this would be training camps as in pre-season. You've got sort of competitive season, and then you've got your off season. So as you can see straight away, the pre-season, the training camp part is by far the highest TRIMP or internal load. Interestingly, this is actually over a 7-week period where we've got this kind of peak here, maybe a slight reduction in load, and then we've gone again with another high week here, and then that tapering effect. So that's another way you can do it. If you've got more time, you can actually almost deload somewhat the following week and then go back up again to provide another big stimulus and then taper back down. It purely depends on how much time you have for pre-season. I think football's probably one of the hardest sports to plan for, actually. A lot of other sports, if you think about individual sports where they've got sometimes months of preparation, you think about even sports like AFL in Australia, where they often have 2 or 3 months pre-season. So football, we're dealing with such short pre-seasons to try and ramp this load up and reduce it down. So it's super difficult. But as you can see, as soon as we go to competition, although there's some up and down fluctuation, broadly speaking, as I showed in that table before on the slide, the load is fairly balanced as well. So we're just basically playing games, bit of training, recovering, keeping the squad as fit and fresh as we can, and keep that going for quite a long period, 30, 40 weeks in the season, which is quite a long time. And lastly, with the first beat system, the way it works with the algorithm, it's really clever, where it will identify these upper and lower thresholds for the player based on historical data. And this is an example here where the player across the season, you can see with the black line, that's the moving sort of average that goes across. And then the dark shaded area, which looks a little bit messy, but essentially that's that upper and lower threshold that's moving across as well. And one thing you can see clearly with the red arrow is when it came to around sort of mid-April, there was this sudden spike or increase in load, which was far above or outside of the norm for this player. What they found in this scenario was actually by the following week, the player became ill, suffered a respiratory issue, and that led to them being out of training for a good few days, and then that hindered the following week's training, as you can see from the sort of gap here. So then you've got that reduction in load and potentially some fitness effect as well. And then luckily they're able to, work back up and get things going again. But I think having something like this, a dashboard like this individually, is really crucial to obviously monitor that effect and see whether your training is in the right sort of balance or zone for your current situation. Okay, so just to summarize, the first thing, as I've kind of banged on a little bit, but heart rate, like I say, it's going to reveal the full picture alongside external load. So GPS alone won't tell you what's happening in terms of the response. But if you put those two things together and evaluate everything, then that's going to give you a much better informed decision. Heart rate as well and first beat, it can really help you plan. And hopefully from the examples I've showed you here, can help you plan and try and achieve your goals in pre-season. And also, with the last slide, for example, we can individualize those decisions. So hopefully by keeping things within the right sort of boundaries and not spiking too much or going too low, we can then hopefully reduce the injury risk and make sure that the players are ready and fresh for the in-season period. And that's me. So hopefully that was useful in terms of some of the concepts. More than happy to answer any questions now, but I thought I'd just leave this here as well. So this is my community, my network that I run, which is both online and in person, called the Football Performance Network. So there's some details here, but if you want to scan the QR code on the right, or my right anyway, you can find out more information, or there's the link there. In addition, feel free to follow me on socials as well. I'm quite active on LinkedIn and Instagram as well. If you want to, continue learning, continue networking, then these options I think could be great for you as well. But yeah, thank you, Tina.
Yeah, thank you, James. Really interesting presentation, and coming from endurance background, I guess I'd have to ask you first, just why do you think it is that the sort of the resistance to heart rate monitoring, does it come because the players don't want to wear belts, or is it more work for the coaches or a combination of both? Or what do you think the reason that it is still quite low?
Yeah, probably a few things really. As I mentioned before, with GPS, it's so much easier in a way for the players to just turn the device on and put it in the vest, and it's become, common practice for them to do so without too much prompting from the scientist. Whereas I think heart rate, yeah, there's the newer vests now which integrate the ECG, which I think could be a good solution. But if you're using the strap from from certain companies, I think they're not the best in terms of the wearability for the players. So a lot of players I work with is often complained, and halfway through the session you just clip them off and just throw them at you. So I think the actual practicalities of wearing heart rate can be a barrier. I think First Beat is one of the best in terms of just the comfort and the fit. A lot of the clients I speak to with the company, often that's the one of the major things they get from the company as well. But then I think the third thing is actually, to get hopefully a good heart rate metric is to get a good max heart rate. And I think in football we're often scared to test maximally a lot of the time. So I think that could also be a reason which does put some practitioners off from using heart rate as a metric.
Yeah, yeah. It'd be interesting to know also how many. And by the way, for the listeners, if you have any questions, just write them in the Q&A, and we'll pick them out from there. But so many people, athletes and regular people, they're going to have some kind of a fitness watch on their wrist, a Garmin or a Polar or a Suunto or something like that. But if it's only that kind of optical heart rate monitoring, certainly all the studies that I've seen and all the experience that I have with data, particularly in high intensity sports situation where you're doing sprints and intervals or some kind of heat training, the accuracy is so poor if you're only relying on that optical data. So certainly if a coach wants accurate data, they'll have to have some kind of a belt or a vest, like you were saying.
Yeah, I found the same both in terms of the research and also myself. I wear Whoop personally, and yeah, I found any sort of high intensity stuff I do, the heart rate's terrible to be honest. It's just lags, real time lag, and just yeah, it just doesn't pick up quite what it should do really. And it's the same, like you say, with endurance sports. If you look at any top endurance runner, you'll see them out on the track, and okay, some of them use the bicep bands now, but a lot of them are still using traditional straps because we know it provides the best and most accurate heart rate data.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You touched upon the supercompensation principle a little bit. I'll have to just comment on that too, because I think that's what I see in endurance sports and any kind of high performers, that the tendency to overdo it is so big, and maybe in teams, particularly with young players who are trying to keep up and kind of prove themselves without any kind of internal load monitoring, they so easily would have all their workouts would be too high of intensity, and that's when it's really tough to get that super compensation, that improvement in performance. And instead, where you want to have your easy workouts and your hard workouts, so certainly that would be where when you emphasize the individualization aspect, that's where that would come really valuable.
Yeah, it's something I saw quite a lot actually in my time at Liverpool. So we would often, those early weeks, we'd have a mixture of players because sometimes the international players would be afforded extra time for the off season. So you'd maybe have half of the youth team players with you as well. And I used to feel sorry for them in a way because they were basically used as extras in the training, and you'd see the heart rate response of some of the guys and they're really struggling to tolerate the load, and they don't have any option because the coach needs bodies. He needs players to coach. And I was speaking to them and say, how you coping with training, and they're just like, I'm dying here. And unfortunately for them, it was a case of just survival, especially the first couple of weeks. And I think that's also a general mistake sometimes coaches and practitioners make, is in week one going a bit too hard, because I think that it's almost again the old school mentality of preseason has to be hard and we have to throw up and things like this. And I saw recently the Brentford 1K test, which is doing the rounds on social media, and pictures of the players lying on the floor completely dead after the test. And I think that's maybe some of the issues, is we see preseason as that a lot of the time, a lot of running, a lot of crazy things, but particularly in weeks 1 where you're coming off the back of maybe not so much training in the off season, you could actually do potentially a lot of damage, which okay, they might get through week 1, but by week 2 and 3, that's where they might start pulling up with some injuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially those who are a little bit less fit to begin with and then trying to keep up, so the intensity creeps up. Yeah, definitely. There's a question here. I'm not familiar with the term myself, but hopefully you are. Do you think that the focus on fast fitness tests like MAS has affected the use of good physiology? And then a continuation to that, how did, can you share anything about how Liverpool used their lactate field test versus lactate on a treadmill? Any comment on that?
Yeah, firstly, thanks, Dave, for the question. Good to see you, mate. But yeah, I think with the mass testing, which has become super popular now, I think in a way it's a good thing because at least we're starting to then use it for good. Well, in most cases anyway, so we're able to prescribe, individual loads and things and runs based off the back of it. That being said, though, I mean, there's still, I think probably if you surveyed a lot of people, there's still a lot of people using yo-yo tests. There's still a lot of people using the 30-15 and things like this. And I think sometimes there's confusion about, are they the same thing when in essence they're not. They're all given different perspectives or different things. So I think with mass in particular, I think there's some really good use from it where we can link it to individual thresholds, and even with GPS as well, we could anchor our individual mass type thresholds based on the player's physiology. And I guess the second part about, unfortunately, I wasn't there at Liverpool when we did the lactate testing. That came a little bit after I was there. But yeah, I guess lactate testing, will tell you something. Like any testing, it will tell you when that, accumulation of lactate occurs, and the later the shift in the curve, as we know, the better, really. But again, it becomes down to, what you do with that information. So I think this is where mass and some of the other things like anaerobic speed reserve and other things that we can derive at least give us more trainability based on the data, as opposed to just saying this player's fit and this player's maybe not so fit. So then what do we do next?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Christian is asking about the vest with ECG. Is that a First Beat product or somebody else? There is a First Beat vest also with the heart rate, accurate heartbeat detection. So you can look up that on the First Beat website. But obviously other companies have that too. And it's true that he's commenting at some of the female players prefer GPS that has a vest because it sits better with their body than like a traditional heart rate belt. So clearly that good fit is really important in that.
Yeah, I think for me that it always seemed a logical solution to have it within, a GPS vest with the ECG. And it actually taken a long time for some companies to adapt the process, but the ones I've spoken to and the practitioners all say it's a much better solution in terms of practicality. But again, it's just to ensure that the heart rate data is good, because I think one of the big problems is that you collect this heart rate data, you download it, you look at the trace and it's all messy and there's dropouts and things and you can't use the data. Whereas GPS, a lot of the time, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a solid trace. So I guess that's on companies like First Beat, hopefully with the technology and the practicality side, to improve that side of things to make it easier to collect that sort of data.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, if you want to learn more about that, check out our website and reach out to our sport team as well. Maybe I'll put our contact information here in the end, so that for anybody who has more questions about the products, we'll send some information on that in the thank you email as well. But here's the sports email address that you can reach out to if you have questions about that, and the guys are happy to tell more about it. I don't see any more questions right now, so I think maybe since it's summertime and it's a nice day, so maybe we'll stop a few minutes early and everyone can go and start their evening workout a little bit earlier or do whatever it is that you need to do. But thank you, James, again for contributing your expertise. It was really great to hear about this, and feel free to be in touch with James directly. You got his contact information, and then you can contact our team if you have any questions. And short summer break from our educational webinars now, and our team will come back with the fall schedule, training schedule in August sometime. So stay tuned to that. But thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, James, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.